Good evening, and welcome once again to another edition of the Shadow Gallery. I am, as always, your host, James Donnelly. And it was brought to my attention tonight by one of my astute followers that a long time ago I started a series called The Greatest Non-Comic Book Films Ever Made. And pointed out to me that I have not finished it. It was a 7-part series. I gave you 6. I'm here to correct that mistake. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying now what you've seen in those previous 6 episodes, I believe in all of them, you've seen the trailers for those films. I'm not going to insert that here because I have enough trouble with copyright issues as far as YouTube is concerned anyway. So I figured, fuck it, let's just do it without and just have a straight discussion about it. So, the number one best non-comic book film ever made. Film that was not a comic book before, could easily be turned into one, and exists very much within a comic book universe, is from the year 2000, Bruce Willis, Samuel L. Jackson, Robin Wright, and M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable. Now, it's interesting because I don't remember this film actually being part of this past decade because it came out so early. And there were so many films after it that kind of changed the landscape. But this is, now that I kind of remember that it came out in 2000, definitely one of my favorite films of, probably one of the 10 best of the last decade. It's just one of those things that just doesn't occur to me for whatever reason. But basically what we have here, one of the reasons that this is number one is that this is kind of, not only is it an extraordinary film, I mean, just from every perspective, from a writing, acting, and technical standpoint, but it's also the most meta of any of the non-comic book films. This is a film that not only acknowledges that comic books do exist and that people are fans of them. You know, it even has that opening kind of title card that says, okay, well, you know, the most expensive comic book in the world sold for this much at, you know, in 2000. And, you know, an actual comic collector will spend upwards of, I think the title card says like $3,000 in his life on a comic book collection. Now, some of us exceed that in a year. Not me, but I know some. And I know that I've spent that much in the last probably 3 or 4 years. Because it is something that once you are a comic book fan, you're extremely passionate about comic books. And you can't go back. You'll stop for a while. It's kind of like, I kind of liken it to, you know, maybe smoking or drinking. It's one of those vices that you just kind of end up having to do again after a little while. But as opposed to drinking or smoking or any of the other bad addictions, this is actually a good addiction. And except in this film, because this takes the idea of the superhero and it puts it into, obviously, a real-world setting, not unlike the ideas of several kind of genre-busting comic books that are out there, such as Watchmen being the most obvious example, where it basically takes the idea of the superhuman and puts it into a real-world scenario. But it also exists within a world where comic books regularly exist, they're regularly published, so on and so forth. And it not only inspires the film, but it inspires one of its lead characters, which is that of Elijah, played by Samuel L. Jackson. And so we basically have, I mean, it's a pretty, you know, as far as the comic book side of the story, it's relatively standard. It's about, you know, David Dunn, played by Bruce Willis, very well played by Bruce Willis, very low-key. It's a very low-key film. It's a very subtle film. There's nothing really forced down your throat until kind of near the end. And even then, it still works. Who has basically, you know, you have this David Dunn, he's a very unhappy human being. And he just doesn't know what his value in life is. He works as a security guard in one of Philadelphia's college stadiums. And you know, after a while, he's the sole survivor of a horrific train crash. If I'm telling you this, I don't know why. You've seen the movie, more than likely. One of the really big things about Unbreakable, as far as it being a comic book film, is its intense use of color and color schemes for the different characters. David Dunn has it's kind of a green, and of course Elijah Price is very much a purple. And so it's use of these kind of odd colors. They're not primary colors, but they are, you know, they're very clear. It is a lot of long, lengthy takes without cuts, suggesting framing of a scene of dialogue in a comic. Very slow, kind of methodical camera movements. You know, these are all very indicative of a comic structure. So not only is it, you know, is it paying homage to comic books, it is actually made very much like a comic book. The discoveries and the discoveries of powers and weaknesses that David has, they're all done in a way that ultimately parallels a comic hero's own discovery. And both Shyamalan and Elijah, the character of Elijah, are very aware of that. They know that they're telling a comic book tale, but within the confines of a real-world scenario. Because what Elijah has been looking for his whole life is because Elijah, he suffers from brittle bone disease, and the kids call him Mr. Glass. And he knows that there must be an opposite to him. If he's one end of the spectrum, he feels that there's somebody else who is the other end of the spectrum who is unbreakable. Bones don't break. He never gets sick. He has basically no weaknesses and is, you know, and has God only knows what kind of powers. It's not set in a typical kind of comic book universe that you would see in, for instance, you know, like the Spider-Man films or the X-Men films or Superman films or what have you. It's more of, you know, this is obviously predating Chris Nolan and his work on the Batman films, but I think I would almost say that maybe some visual cues were taken from Unbreakable in some of Chris Nolan's Batman work. Because it's set, you know, it's set in a very gritty and relatively grim reality. And the scene with Willis first going to use his powers in the train station for the first time, it's totally unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. It's totally fascinating. It just really captures your imagination. And again, we come to the use of color because, you know, each person that he touches, that he picks up this psychic, you know, resonance from, they have this flash of color, whether it's the jumpsuit orange or, you know, the yellow of the jacket or whatever. that he sees in his head. The fact that David can finally use his abilities to make the world a better place is when he finally feels for the first time. He allows himself the emotional connection to say, you know what, I'm finally at where I'm supposed to be. And his wife, played by Robin Wright, there's a comfort there, as well as, of course, then you have the young boy who's been played, the son, played by Spencer Treat Clark, who has been influenced both by seeing his father and also by Elijah's character. That, and there's that great scene in the kitchen where the son has the gun and he's going to kill, he's going to shoot his father in the understanding that the bullet will just bounce right off. There's the scene in, well, first of all, I love the idea also of the comic book gallery, the comic art gallery, I should say, and that whole scene with Samuel L. Jackson and the prospective buyer, basically, where he just basically tells the guy to fuck off. This is not, this is not stuff for kids. This is stuff for serious art collectors, because this is serious art, which is something that most people don't get when it comes to comic books. The type of the work that goes into creating a page of comics, that is truly art. And I think that we shortchange comic book artists sometimes when we say, well, their stuff is, I don't really like it too much. But you still have to realize that this is somebody who can do it a lot better than you can, for the most part. Unless you are indeed a comic book artist, in which case you can do it probably just as well as they can, and in some cases probably even better. But one of the things that stands out to me more than anything else, more than the ending, more than pretty much almost any other scene, is the scene in which Elijah is sitting with David and his son, talking about that comic books are essentially our mythology. It's a uniquely American art form, and we've seen, and how you see art through how pictorial art through the ages, from from cave drawings through to comic books. I mean, it really, it is all of this human history is encapsulated in pictorial art. And so that is kind of one of the basis of my own ideas about how comic books are mythology. It's the mythology of the 20th and centuries on. This will be the legacy that our century leaves. It won't be in film. It won't be in music. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it won't. I don't think it will be as strongly in these other things as much as it will be in comic books, because comic books will tell a story. It will tell the stories of everything that has come since the inception of the comic book back in the 1930s. Of the serialized, from the serialized comic strip to the actual comic book to what we have now, hundreds of titles coming out every month, or hundreds of issues, I should say, not hundreds of titles. But I mean, it really is, and that's one of the things the film respects so much. I mean, it's an extraordinarily well-made film. It is really one of the best films that I've seen in the last 12 years. And I wish that wasn't Shyamalan's last good film. Certainly not the case for Sam Jackson or Bruce Willis, because they've gone on to make films that are also pretty goddamn good. So, but anyway, so that's it for the best non-comic book films ever made. So if you like this, I hope that you watch the others of this series. I hope that if you're a comic book fan, I hope that you like my comic vlog. I hope that you follow me on Twitter at Donnelly92274. I'm on Facebook, James Donnelly, and I'm on Tumblr at shadowgallerycomics.tumblr.com. So that's it, people. Thanks for watching. It's been fun. You have a good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day that you're watching this. This is James Donnelly from the Shadow Gallery, signing off.